Good afternoon. So today we are going to be talking about the first part of our conversation about civil liberties, and my hope for this video is just to catch us up a little bit so that we only have to spend a little bit of time talking about these issues in class. So let's start by defining civil liberties, which is the individual's freedoms guaranteed to the people primarily by the Bill of Rights. These typically involve the restraining of government so that it does not impede the rights of an individual. So these really lay the foundation for what we know as our individual freedoms. And these are primarily protected in the First Amendment, though all the other ones as well. And we'll talk through what some of those mean. Because I want us to spend some time thinking through the meaning of these amendments and how our own life is impacted by civil liberties, we're going to concentrate on a couple of these amendments. So we'll talk first about the First Amendment. We'll go through that pretty much explicitly. Then we'll talk more in the stuff that you saw on the videos and the group work that we'll do. We'll talk more about the Fourth Amendment and the Ninth Amendment. And this is not to say that there aren't other important pieces of these amendments, but for our purposes, that's what we are going to concentrate on. So, okay. Now, the thing is that a lot of times we can confuse or at least not quite understand the differences between civil liberties and civil rights. So I wanted to point that out here because we'll talk about civil rights next week. So civil liberties involve restraining the government's actions against individuals. So civil liberties fall into that definition we used earlier in the semester where we called it negative freedom. So it restrains the government's actions to protect individual freedom. Civil rights, on the other hand, are rights that all individuals share as provided for in the 14th Amendment, which we'll talk more about next week when we talk about civil rights. The 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under the law. Now, the important piece of this is that, or maybe the way to think about this is that civil liberties and civil rights sort of operate together to give people what they need to be able to be functioning members of our society and our political community. So civil liberties protect people from government interference, but civil rights are the things that allow everyone to take advantage of those civil liberties. So civil rights are more along the lines of positive freedom, so people have the freedom to. And because most of the time civil rights are, we talk about them in the context of political social minorities in the United States, then we can think about this in terms of civil rights guaranteeing everybody's access to government solutions and to their civil liberties. So why do we have to have this conversation? What's going on here? Why do we need to think about civil liberties? Well, what it comes down to in many cases, and the founders saw it this way as well, is that really this is about a conflict of rights. And it's part of government's overall job to help us figure that out, to help us understand how to reconcile conflicts of rights. So think about it this way. The first kind of conflict of rights is individual versus individual. Do individual people's rights, their liberties overlap all the time, right? So one of the challenges or one of the ways that we think about civil liberties in particular is laying out the groundwork for what is the protection of an individual in relationship to another individual. So we're going to find out, for example, that freedom of speech is pretty broad in our system. In fact, probably broader than almost any other system in the world. However, there are times when freedom of speech is limited in order to protect other individuals, right? So the other thing we can think about too is the idea of how do we think about public officials, right? So public officials have, to some degree, some rights of privacy, but don't citizens' right to know what their elected officials think and how they make decisions? Isn't that part of this question as well? And so this is where we end up having court cases. This is where we end up talking through the limits of these liberties, because the rights of individuals can overlap with the rights of other individuals. But the thing is that there's also rights of the individual that overlaps with rights of society, right? So does the individual's right somehow contradict the state's interest in keeping order or in the good of society? And so this is another one of those places where we spend a lot of time sort of thinking through what are the appropriate limits of individual rights versus the appropriate limits of the rights of society. And we'll talk a lot about that actually when we talk about the Fourth Amendment, because we're going to spend a lot of time talking about search and seizure and the rights of the accused. So we end up we mediate these conflicts, these rights conflicts, in a wide variety of ways. And really all parts of society are part of this mediation. So remember from our original conversation, our original definition of politics, right? That part of politics is the resolution of conflict. Well, this mediation of rights conflict happens in the context of politics. So the government is part of that. So the president and public opinion, our approval of the president and the president's sort of leadership in terms of creating new policy, legislation in Congress, the courts, and so are things like interest groups and voting, and how the media gives us information about politics and government. So government is part of this, but individuals are very much part of this as well. So we're constantly thinking about this, even in our own context, right? We've talked about the notion of public trust, right? Like, why do people stop at a red light? Well, because in that sense, that's an individual thinking through what that rights conflict looks like. So we all have rights to be safe in our cars. And so in some ways, it's a societal right, but in other ways, it's a way that individuals mediate that. And then interest groups and social movements basically spend a whole lot of time doing just this, right? What's the right of government? What's the right of individuals? Do other kinds of organizations like businesses have rights in this context? And how do we think through how can we live together safely and effectively in the context of the mediation of these rights? All right, so while we tend to think about civil liberties entirely in the context of the Bill of Rights, there are a few protections that are actually in the Constitution, in the original Constitution as written. And I just want to point that out. The first is the right to habeas corpus, which is a fancy Latin term for habeas corpus means to have control over your body. I mean, like, that's the literal meaning of it. But what it means is it's to know the charges against you. So to not be held indefinitely without being charged, right? So that's, you have the right to the control of your body unless the government has a reason why they ought to lock you up. That's the basic idea behind that term. So this was important in the original Constitution because this is one of the primary problems that the American colonists were having with the British government at the time, is that there was no right to habeas corpus under British law, or under at least how the British law was being implemented in the colonies. And so the idea was that the government cannot hold you without charges, period. Now, there are places where this gets suspended. We'll talk about this later on when we talk about presidential emergency powers. So, for example, President Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War and held people without charge, mostly just to keep them out of the conversation so that they couldn't make trouble in the northern states by espousing Confederate views. And there's some questions about how do we think about the context of habeas corpus in our current situation where we hold suspected terrorists in Guantanamo Bay without charging them. And that's the question of, is that are these only for citizens, or are these rights for everybody? And this is a live question, so I don't have an answer for that. The other constitutional protections are more sort of not necessarily mundane, but they're more specific to the context of the drafting of the Constitution. The first one is that there cannot be a bill of attainder, which means a law to target a single person. So you cannot make a law that only applies to one person. And then there cannot be what are called ex post facto laws, which basically means that you cannot make something illegal after the fact. So you can change the law, right? You can make something illegal, but people cannot be punished for doing something in the past that was illegal when they did it, but no longer legal. So that's what the protection against ex post facto laws is. Okay, so the Bill of Rights, remember, just sort of as a reminder from our constitutional conversation, the Bill of Rights is a bill of limits. And most importantly, it only limits the national government up until the 14th Amendment after the Civil War, when the Bill of Rights was incorporated to the states. So at the beginning, it was, as originally written, only limited the behavior of the national government. So that's really an important distinction to make as we think through what the context is of those other, of the first 10 amendments are. But it's the 14th Amendment that incorporated these civil liberties to the states. Okay, so we're going to talk more specifically about the First Amendment. Right now, in this video, I'm going to cover freedom of religion. And then in class on Thursday, I will cover freedom of speech and basically freedom of expression. So freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, which are all the other sort of sections of the First Amendment. And we'll do that before we break into groups. So let's talk about the religion clauses in the First Amendment. Now, if this stuff is interesting to you, I know that in our religion and politics class, which is taught by a variety of people in the department, most of us who teach it spend a while talking about these religion clauses. And it's sort of interesting because in a lot of ways, understanding how the religion clauses got written gives us a picture of what was going on in the first Congress as they were creating the text for these first 10 amendments. So the first part of the freedom of religion piece of the First Amendment is called the Establishment Clause. And basically it says, Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion. So what does that mean? Well, again, as with several other amendments, where the commas are and how things are written makes a difference. So it certainly means no state churches, that they were so explicitly outlawing the idea that there would be a specific state church. Now remember, that was only for the national government. So states, the individual states had official churches for quite a while. Many of them did. In fact, up until the 1830s, many states had official churches. But the idea was that there could not be agreement. So they could not have one single church or we think of it as denomination now. So no single Protestant church could be the official church. The idea was not to have a national church like the Church of England. Now, the Establishment Clause also has in it, or it's clear that it says no state support of churches. Now, this is another complicated one because we've had to push forward in this to talk about what constitutes a support of a church or support of a religious body. Right? The Establishment Clause jurisprudence, so meaning the decisions that the Supreme Court has made about the Establishment Clause. The textbook that I use in my religion and politics class actually calls it chaos with an index, because there's no sort of solid through line of decision-making from the incorporation of the religious clauses in the 1940s to today. But basically the idea is that the one bottom line we can come to is that the government cannot support a religious function of a religious organization. Okay, so obviously no direct support to to church buildings, right, or to people who are the leaders of those churches. But if that church or synagogue or mosque or organization is doing something that is non-religious, government can help fund that. So, for example, one of the classic cases about Establishment Clause comes from a decision about school buses. And in fact, the way it worked was that this town in New Jersey didn't have actual school buses. All the kids rode to school on the city buses. And the argument that was made was basically the city buses wouldn't take the kids who went to a religious school for free while they were taking kids who went to a public school for free. And the Supreme Court basically said, yes, if a city is using a city bus system with vouchers for public school, they can also pay for private and parochial religious schools, because that's not a support of religion. That's a support of students going to school. You can see where actually in schooling is where most of these things become the most complex, and things like, can the state give grants for purchase of non-religious school books? So if it's a math book, right, it's very hard for a math book to be a religious book. So can the state help pay for math books in religious schools? There's all these kinds of questions that come up. But the bottom line is that our context of the idea of the separation of church and state is not actually in the First Amendment. The idea, the wall of separation, is actually from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Committee, so a group of Baptists in Connecticut, around the time of the ratification controversy. And basically what he says is that there should be this wall of separation between churches and states, both to protect churches from the state, but more importantly, to protect the state from the church. And this is actually important to Baptists, because at this time they were kind of a minority, and so they were very concerned about the idea of a established church that would persecute religious minorities, the way the Church of England had for Quakers and Puritans and Baptists and all sorts of other people in England. So the question that comes up in many cases now then is that many people who believe that government ought to help churches in their non-religious functions say, well, this is just saying that the government cannot favor one church over another, not that it cannot favor religion at all, right? So many people who have no religious beliefs have made the argument, well, the government shouldn't be supporting religion at all. And this is the crux of the conflict, and where many of the arguments that have come before the Supreme Court, even in the last few years, things like the Legacy Bake Shop and the question of whether people who are religiously opposed to gay marriage are whether they're required to make a wedding cake for a same-sex couple getting married. And the Supreme Court said, no, you don't have to do that. So that is sort of not necessarily in line with other decisions that they've made. So again, chaos with an index. The free exercise clause is a little bit more clear, only because this sort of definition of rights is a little bit easier. So the free exercise clause is based on the sort of fundamental commitment from the founders that people get to believe what they want to believe, period, right? So you'll often hear this talked about in terms of freedom of conscience. But the thing is that it's not clear that freedom of conscience actually moves into action. So basically, the Supreme Court has decided that people are free to believe whatever they want, but they're not necessarily free to act on that belief. What does that mean? Well, okay, so the far out example here is a classic sort of definition or a classic conflict between individual rights, right? So under the way the free exercise clause is written, any of those sort of initial what we call Central American religions that required Human sacrifice, right? Those would not, that free exercise would not be protected. Why? Because an individual's right of conscience cannot trump somebody else's right to live, right? So that's why it's freedom of conscience, not necessarily action. Again, that's a way far out example. But other kinds of free exercise issues have come into play about things like, particularly as we move into a situation where we have immigrants from all over the world and different kinds of religious practices. So there have been a lot of court cases about different kinds of hallucinogenic drugs that are used in certain kinds of religious practice, from the Native American church to a hallucinogenic tea from Southeast Asia that was being imported in. And then things like Santeria, so like animal sacrifices. Are you allowed to sacrifice a goat in your backyard? And there's a whole long court case about whether that's legitimate or not. So the free exercise clause, generally speaking, is pretty solid, though much of the time it's sort of dealt with as a free speech issue. So it's less exercise, so less like actual practice and more about speech. But the bottom line for free exercise has been that there needs to be a compelling state interest for the state to step in and stop a free exercise. So that's the question in many cases. Is there a compelling state interest to say, for example, make people whose Sabbath is on Friday or Saturday not open their place of business on Sunday, even though the majority of people in America's Sabbath is on Sunday, right? And that's been a place where the Supreme Court has said, no, there's no compelling state interest to force those people to keep their businesses closed on Sunday when that's not their Sabbath. So we can talk more about the free exercise. So I'm going to end here, and we'll start talking about freedom of speech on Thursday when we get to class.